Oh, you joined me. Hold on a sec. Let me get the light. There we go. Yes, I was just sitting here in the dark, waiting. Not creepy at all. Glad you made it. Take a few seconds to get comfy and maybe grab your favorite John Stamos body pillow and assume the big spoon position. How about we put a little burning fireplace in that bottom right corner for some ambient noise? Fireplace, please. Guys, the fireplace. There it is, splendid. Hard to find good help these days. Wait, that is much too large. Smaller, please, and in the corner. Good. Now how about some embers? Embers, please. Very good. Looks like we are all set for this monumental journey now. But first, if you would not mind liking and subscribing. It really helps us out more than you know. And drop a comment on what country you reside in, as we are always curious on where our viewers are from. Now, let's begin. Before they were horned helmet-wearing legends, which, by the way, they absolutely were not, the Vikings were just a bunch of cold, frustrated farmers staring at too many rocks and not enough bread. They lived in Scandinavia, a stretch of chilly land where the sun visited briefly in the summer and completely ghosted them in the winter. With terrible soil, long winters, and zero TikTok, they had nothing better to do than argue about goats and sharpen axes. They weren't called Vikings yet. That word came from Viking, meaning pirate or sea raider. But at this early point, they were still proto-pirates, more like soggy fishermen with anger issues. Their villages were small, their homes made of wood, thatch, and hope it doesn't rain again. Everyone smelled faintly of smoked fish, wool, and existential dread. Religion? Oh, they had it. Odin, Thor, Loki, not just movie characters, but actual deities they blamed whenever someone dropped their bread in the mud. These gods were dramatic, often angry, and loved turning into animals. Their myths were wild and frost giants, talking squirrels, and a tree that held the universe. Imagine growing up with that bedtime story. By 700 AD, things were brewing. They had boats, not fancy boats, just float and pray boats. But they noticed something. Across the seas were monasteries filled with gold, food, and absolutely zero swords. That's like dangling a meatball in front of a hungry wolf. And thus, an idea formed. Maybe if we can't grow wealth, we can row over and borrow some from others, violently. And so our slightly damp heroes were set on a course that would make them legends, not for their fashion, not for their farming, but for their decision to sail west with sharp things and questionable manners. In the year 793, a group of very determined Norsemen paddled across the North Sea and politely introduced themselves to the world by burning down a monastery. The place was Lindisfarne, a quiet, holy island where monks were peacefully writing scrolls, sipping warm broth, and doing absolutely nothing to deserve what was coming. Then, boom, Vikings. Wet, loud, and way too excited. To the monks, it must have looked like a group of angry trees had come alive and started screaming in Old Norse. The Vikings weren't here to chat about theology. They came for treasure, food, and probably to stretch their legs after rowing for days. The raid was swift and chaotic. Crosses were stolen, candles were smashed, and one poor monk probably got tackled while trying to save the cheese wheel. The news of this raid spread like wildfire, or like word of mouth, which was their version of wildfire. Europe was horrified. Who are these loud axe-waving lunatics, and why are they so good at boating? Kings began sleeping with one eye open. Coastal villagers started hiding their valuables in places the Vikings hopefully wouldn't look. Spoiler, they looked everywhere. This wasn't a one-time outburst. It was just the opening act. The Vikings had tasted victory and realized something crucial. Monasteries were rich, poorly defended, and had way too many breakable items, they basically became the go-to vacation spots for future raids. Book a longship, pack a sword, and hit the holy hotspots. Back home, raiders returned as heroes. You looted a church, you're promoted. The economy was booming, if your idea of an economy is mostly gold cups and the occasional panicked monk. This early success only fueled their ambitions. Raiding wasn't just fun, it was profitable, addictive, like pillaging with frequent flyer miles. After Lindisfarne, the Vikings realized something shocking. Raiding wasn't just a weekend hobby, it could be a full-time career. So, they went pro. Soon, their longships were popping up like surprise guests at every coastal town party. Except they didn't bring gifts. They brought fire, axes, and a complete disregard for your town's zoning laws. They expanded fast. Ireland, raided, then settled, then raided again for good measure. France, also raided, though the locals preferred to call it a horrifying nightmare. The Vikings even pushed east toward what would one day be Russia, setting up trade routes and politely threatening anyone who looked like they had coins. They weren't just violent tourists, they were clever, organized, and weirdly ambitious. They built entire fleets of longships with terrifying speed, sleek, wooden missiles powered by arms, ambition, and a diet of dried fish and pure adrenaline. These boats were fast, too fast. Towns barely had time to say, "What's that horn sound?" before their granaries were on fire. Eventually they stopped leaving after the raids. They stayed. They set up camps, then towns, then kingdoms. Nice spot you've got here. Mind if we violently occupy it forever? They even established Dublin. Yes, the Irish capital was basically a Viking side project. They named it Dyflin, which sounds like a brand of yogurt, but stuck around anyway. And not all Vikings were pillagers. Some were traders. They bartered furs, weapons, and slaves, because unfortunately, slavery was very much part of their business plan. They also loved shiny things, silks, spices, coins, and anything that looked like it belonged in a treasure chest. If it glittered, it got grabbed. Back home, villages grew rich on the loot. Status was measured in gold, battle scars, and how many terrified monks remembered your name. Viking culture bloomed, full of feasting, storytelling, and sword-swinging contests that probably ended with someone losing an ear. This era wasn't just chaos, it was expansion. Europe was learning, slowly and with great discomfort, that these Norsemen weren't just raiders, they were becoming a civilization with a flag, a fleet, and a serious case of wanderlust. Believe it or not, Vikings had lives that didn't involve stabbing. Shocking, we know. When they weren't raiding monasteries or renaming your village something unpronounceable, they were surprisingly normal. Well, as normal as people could be while worshipping thunder gods and using whale bones as toothbrushes. Their homes were longhouses, big wooden rectangles that smelled like smoke, stew, wet dog, and ambition. Everyone lived in the same room: mom, dad, kids, grandma, livestock, and probably a guy named Bjorn who just wouldn't move out. There was no central heating, but who needed it when you had 7 goats and a communal body odor to keep things toasty? Viking fashion? Layers. So many layers. Wool tunics, cloaks, fur capes, not because it was stylish, but because freezing to death was very out that season. Both men and women wore jewelry made of bronze or silver. Nothing screamed status like jangling when you walked. Hygiene was better than you'd expect. Combs, tweezers, and soap made from animal fat kept them cleanish. Saturday was bath day, which made them the clean freaks of medieval Europe. Seriously, Europeans thought they were too clean. Imagine that. Women had more rights than in most places of the time. They could own land, divorce, and run households. If you messed with a Viking woman, you might find yourself politely disemboweled. Children? Expected to grow up fast. By age 6, they were already helping farm, feed animals or hold a shield, while Dad practiced dramatic yelling. Meals weren't all meat and mead. They ate porridge, bread, vegetables and fish. A lot of fish. If you hated fish, tough luck. You were going to taste it in every dish, drink, and probably your dreams. Drinking horns were a thing, yes, but they also drank from wooden cups and didn't actually shout "Skål" every 5 seconds. Sometimes they just drank quietly while judging each other. So while the outside world saw brutal warriors, Viking villages were bustling with farms, families, craftspeople, and surprisingly well-groomed beards. They weren't just conquerors, they were humans, hungry, hard-working, and occasionally hilarious humans. The secret to Viking success wasn't just muscles and mustaches, it was boats. Beautiful, terrifying boats. The longship was their crown jewel, a sleek, fast, shallow-bottomed slice of aquatic doom that could glide through oceans. These weren't rafts, these were Norse Ferraris made of oak and attitude. Built with planks riveted together like a puzzle made by someone with a grudge. Longships were light enough to carry over land, which they did often while grumbling and tripping over tree roots. With a single square sail and up to 60 angry men rowing in sync, they could go from dot on the horizon to sword in your pantry in no time. Navigation? They didn't have maps or compasses. They had something better, sheer nerve and magic rocks. Crystals that helped find the sun's position on cloudy days. Combine that with bird behavior, wind patterns, sea color, and pure stubbornness, and somehow they found their way across oceans. GPS? More like grit, paddles, and shouting. Viking shipbuilders were highly respected, probably because they built machines that could both invade a country. Carving a dragon head on the prow wasn't just flair, it was to scare away sea monsters, spirits, and anyone with bad taste in boat design. These ships were both tools and symbols, floating war banners that said, "We're here, we're loud, and we might accidentally conquer you." Inside the boat, livestock tied to wherever livestock could fit. Imagine rowing for days next to a chicken, and a guy who thinks singing sea shanties off-key is hilarious. But these longships weren't just for raiding, they were for exploring, trading, and relocating entire families who were tired of snow. They opened the world, and whether it was to steal, settle, or simply see what was out there, the Vikings sailed farther than most dared to dream, powered by wood, wind, and absolute refusal to stay home. At some point, a Viking looked at the ocean and said, "What if we just kept going?" And because Vikings weren't great at turning down a dare, that's exactly what they did. They sailed west. They had vibes and extremely questionable weather reports. First stop, Iceland. It was volcanic, weird, and cold so naturally they loved it. Perfect place for farming rocks and arguing about sheep. They settled quickly and built a society with laws, poetry, and an unhealthy number of volcanic near-death experiences. Next came Greenland, which they named to trick people. It was mostly ice. Calling it Icy Doom Island probably didn't pass the marketing test. Then came the big one, North America. Yep, centuries before Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean while trying to order Indian takeout, the Vikings had already set foot in what they called Vinland. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who was either a brilliant navigator or extremely allergic to staying put, led the charge. Around the year 1000, they landed in modern-day Canada, looked around. The land was beautiful and bountiful, but the locals, indigenous tribes, who had zero interest in bearded trespassers, made it clear this would not be a long-term rental. After a few tense encounters, and probably some very awkward trade negotiations involving fish, the Vikings packed up and left. They discovered a new world, but couldn't hold on to it. Still, it's wild to think they reached the Americas centuries before everyone else. No giant empires, no lasting cities, just a brief pit stop in the saga of exploration. But it proved something: the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were seafarers with itchy feet and terrible vacation planning skills. Their stories stretched across continents, from Arctic cliffs to American shores, and they did it all in wooden boats, with no compass, no GPS, and definitely no backup plan, just grit, wind, and the occasional angry puffin. To understand the Vikings, you've got to understand their gods, who were basically cosmic drama queens with weapons. Norse mythology was not gentle bedtime stuff. It was a wild mix of talking wolves, world-ending dragons, and gods who solved problems with hammers instead of therapy. Subtlety was not their thing. At the top was Odin, the All-Father part wizard, part warlord, and full-time one-eyed philosopher. He sacrificed his own eye for wisdom, which sounds noble until you realize he probably still bumped into furniture a lot. Then there was Thor, thunder god, hammer enthusiast, and the original smash first, explain later kind of guy. And Loki, trickster, shapeshifter, and the reason nobody left their mead unattended. The Vikings believed the universe was a giant tree Yggdrasil holding 9 worlds in its branches. Earth, the land of gods, the land of ice, the land of fire, the land of awkward dwarves making magical objects all stacked like a cosmic Jenga tower. Beneath it all slithered a dragon named Nugr, who chewed on the roots like an eternal termite with anger issues. Death wasn't the end. It was just your first job review. If you died in battle, congratulations, you might make it to Valhalla, an enormous warrior afterlife where you drank endless mead and fought all day for fun. Like a violent Viking theme park with unlimited snacks. Not hell like fire and brimstone, just cold, grey, and deeply unimpressive. Like the waiting room of the afterlife, they took religion seriously. Rituals, sacrifices, and strange symbols carved into stones were everywhere. Some offerings were basic food, weapons, animals. Others involved more complicated choices. Their myths explained thunder, lightning, earthquakes, and why life was hard. They were moral lessons, epic tales, and wild metaphors rolled into a worldview where the world could end at any moment, and it probably would in a final battle called Ragnarok. Fire, ice, chaos, and one last round of dramatic shouting. Until then, the Vikings prayed, feasted, fought, and lived with the gods in their stories larger than life. Deeply flawed and absolutely unforgettable. For a bunch of people known for chaos, the Vikings actually had rules. Lots of them. Viking society ran on law, loud, public, occasionally bloody law, and if you broke it, there were consequences. Not always consistent consequences, but definitely loud ones. Think less courtroom gavel and more angry crowd with opinions and axes. The Vikings had no police force. Instead, they had a system called the Thing, which sounds like a suspicious creature under your bed, but was actually a kind of public assembly. It was part parliament, part courtroom, and part community gossip fest. Everyone showed up chieftains. If you had a beard and didn't smell like you just lost a duel, you could probably vote. Disputes were handled out loud, in front of the whole community. Land disagreements, cattle theft, murder all up for debate. If found guilty, you might pay a fine called wergil, literally man money. The value depended on status. Accidentally chopped down a noble? But if you skipped your payment or acted like a jerk, you could be declared outlaw. That meant no protection under the law, and anyone could legally turn you into a human pincushion. Outlaws ran into the woods, where they usually starved, froze, or started talking to squirrels. And then there were blood feuds, the Viking version of holding grudges, but with slightly more axe wounds. Families feuded over goats, fences, bad soup, you name it. So he cursed my cow storylines. Still, the laws held society together. In a world of blades and beards, the legal system gave people a way to resolve issues that didn't always involve setting things on fire. Usually, the Vikings weren't just lawless barbarians. They were complex, organized, and surprisingly bureaucratic. Assuming your bureaucracy includes yelling, threats, and the occasional spear. If you think Viking women were stuck in kitchens stirring fish stew and sighing dramatically, think again. These ladies could run farms, manage estates, divorce their husbands, and in some cases, make your spine reconsider its life choices. Viking society gave women more rights than most places at the time. They could own land, they could inherit property, and if a marriage went sour, which included the house if she owned it, and leave. No courtroom drama, no awkward couples therapy, just you keep the goats. In taking the longhouse at home, Viking women ruled the domestic domain like queens with strong opinions. They ran the household finances, organized the food stores, and kept the family from accidentally eating poisonous berries. If their husbands were off raiding monasteries or arguing with monks, the women held down the fort, literally and figuratively. They weren't waiting by the window, they were fixing fences, burying jars of silver, and teaching the kids not to poke the blacksmith. Then there were the shield maidens, the warrior women of legend. It's debated how many actually existed, but Norse sagas loved a good tale of a woman in armor, hurling herself into battle while men screamed, "Wait!" History and legend blurred. Women mattered. Goddesses like Freya, Frigg, and Hel weren't background extras. They were powerful, mysterious, and occasionally terrifying. Freya rode into battle in a chariot pulled by cats. If that doesn't demand respect, nothing does. Marriage wasn't all romance and poetry. It was a business arrangement. Families negotiated dowries, cows were discussed. She was a partner with sharp elbows and legal leverage. So yes, Viking women churned butter, wove cloth, raised children, and managed households. But they also traded, defended their land, and buried axes in places where the sun don't shine if provoked. In a world of stormy seas and flying arrows, they didn't just survive, they thrived. After a long day of rowing, raiding, or wondering why goats scream like that, Vikings liked to unwind the old-fashioned way with a good story told by someone dramatically standing near a fire and waving their arms too much. Enter the skalds, Viking storytellers, historians, comedians, and unofficial gossip columnists rolled into one. Viking culture was built on oral tradition. They didn't have novels or TikTok. They had memory, rhythm, and the ability to make a story last for 6 hours without blinking. These weren't bedtime tales. They were sagas, epic poems of love, revenge, adventure, and people being dramatically betrayed by their cousins. Always a cousin, sagas were passed down through generations, carved into memory like runes in stone. And speaking of runes, yes, they had writing, but they mostly used it for marking names, curses. They relied on word of mouth. That meant the skalds had to be good. No pressure, just your entire culture's memory depending on your ability to rhyme about Bjorn's doomed romance with a cursed walrus. The stories were wild. Heroes sailed to magical lands. Trolls lived in mountains. Gods showed up at weddings uninvited. Some tales were historical-ish, some pure myth, and many were a blend like Viking smoothies made with battle, betrayal, and bizarre dream sequences. And if a storyteller forgot a detail, no problem. Just add more lightning. Or another cousin feud. Nobody was taking notes. These stories weren't just entertainment. They shaped identity. Kids grew up hearing about great warriors, clever queens, and poor decisions that led to entire villages burning down. They learned what it meant to be brave, loyal, or, at the very least, not to insult a neighbor with a goat fetish. The sagas outlived the storytellers. Eventually, monks and scholars wrote them down, preserving names like Egil, Gudrun, and the unfortunate Thorstein Flatnose. Thanks to them, we still know about the Viking world, not just from battles and boats, but from the words that echoed around fires long after the axes were put away. For a civilization known for swinging swords, the Vikings spent a suspicious amount of time selling things. Turns out, beneath the raiding there was a serious business plan. Viking merchants traveled far and wide, with their longships doubling as mobile storefronts. Their trade routes stretched from the chilly fjords of Scandinavia to the bazaars of Baghdad and the shimmering courts of Constantinople. If it sparkled, smoked, or smelled exotic, they wanted it. Silks, spices, glassware, wine, silver, and even peacocks, yes. Someone actually sailed home with a bird that looked like it had been invented by a drunken god. They brought their own goods too: furs, iron, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves. Yep, the Viking economy had a dark side. Slavery was common, with captives taken during raids sold off across Europe and the Middle East. It was brutal, and unfortunately, very profitable. Even the fiercest warriors needed income, and not everyone was cut out to sell knitted socks. Vikings didn't use coins at first. They operated on weight-based silver hack silver. You cut off pieces of silver to pay for goods, like some sort of violent vending machine. Later, they adopted coinage from foreign lands, and some Viking chieftains even minted their own money, name on metal people used to buy cheese. Markets were lively affairs. Imagine loud negotiations, piles of fur, strong smells, and at least one guy yelling about goats no one asked for. There were traveling caravans, riverside bazaars, and ports filled with shouting, laughter, and the occasional sword fight over onion prices. Even their settlements reflected this trade obsession. Towns like Hedeby and Birka were major commercial hubs, bustling, multilingual, and full of things that could either improve your wardrobe or start a feud. Vikings weren't just pirates with a branding issue. They were international businessmen, part warrior, part wheeler-dealer, with a fondness for shiny things and a talent for moving them across oceans. While most of Europe was busy boarding up their monasteries, the Vikings quietly discovered something equally profitable in the other direction: rivers. Lots of them, flowing deep into the lands that would eventually become Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And where there's a river, there's opportunity. And where there's opportunity, there's usually a Viking with a boat and questionable manners. These Norse travelers were called the Varangians, and they didn't sail east just to say hi. They followed the mighty rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, paddling through endless forests, avoiding mosquitoes the size of horses, and trading with Slavic tribes. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they looted, sometimes both. They founded key settlements, including Novgorod and Kiev names, that would become part of the rise of the Kievan Rus. According to legend, the Slavs were tired of squabbling and invited a Viking named Rurik to come rule them. That's one way to solve political instability: hire the loudest foreigner with a beard and a sword. Rurik accepted, and thus began a Norse dynasty in the east. The Vikings blended into Slavic culture surprisingly well, adopting customs, languages, and fur-lined fashion, but they never lost their flair for danger. Some even became elite soldiers in the Byzantine Empire, known as the Varangian Guard Emperor, protecting bad guys in gold helmets, who spent their weekends lifting heavy things and intimidating palace guests. They earned a reputation for loyalty, strength, and the ability to drink wine in terrifying quantities. The Byzantine emperors loved them, probably because no one else volunteered to bodyguard a man who wore a crown and had 400 enemies. These Eastern adventures weren't just about power, they were about trade, travel, and influence. Amber, furs, honey, and swords flowed south, silks, spices, and coins flowed north. Cultures mixed, accents tangled, and somewhere along the line, the rough outlines of modern Russia were drawn in Viking ink. So while their cousins were harassing monks in England, these Vikings were building dynasties, founding cities, and casually reshaping history, one river at a time. If there's one thing Vikings loved more than storytelling, it was violently interrupting someone else's. Enter Viking combat, where the goal was simple: don't die, and, if possible, make the other guy regret ever learning to walk. They didn't fight with elegance, they fought with enthusiasm, yelling, and an arsenal that could fill a very aggressive museum. The average Viking wasn't weighed down with shiny armor. Iron was expensive, and chainmail was for the rich kids. Most wore wool, leather, and swords, the holy trinity of medieval mayhem. Swords were the most prized. If your sword didn't have a name like Skull Melter, were you even trying? Their most iconic defense? The round wooden shield, painted, reinforced, and perfect for turning your enemies into pancakes. Vikings used the shield wall tactic, standing shoulder to shoulder like an angry wooden fence. It was teamwork, intimidation, and splinter delivery system all in one. And then there were the berserkers, legendary warriors, who allegedly fought in a trance-like fury. Some say they took drugs or mushrooms to trigger this rage. Whether myth or real, nobody wanted to be on the other side of one. Battles were loud, brutal, and rarely clean. No choreographed swordplay. Just chaos, sweat, and the occasional surprise goose. Victory meant loot, glory, and a better story around the fire. Defeat meant becoming part of someone else's story, usually as a cautionary tale. And when they weren't fighting people, they were practicing throwing axes at trees, wrestling in fields, or swinging sticks at brothers who accidentally insulted Mum's stew again. Combat was a part of life, like breathing or sarcastic insults. Despite their reputation, Vikings weren't mindless brutes. They planned, they trained, and they knew how to hold a line. Their strength wasn't just in muscles, it was in coordination, strategy, and knowing when to scream and when to duck. Which, to be fair, at some point the Vikings stopped just raiding Britain and decided to stay. Permanently. Maybe they liked the weather. Maybe they liked the sheep. Maybe they were just tired of rowing. Whatever the reason, starting in the late 800s, large numbers of Norsemen began settling into the land they had previously been lighting on fire. This wasn't a polite move-in. They arrived swinging swords and demanding real estate. Whole regions of England fell under Viking control, eventually forming what was known as the Danelaw, a chunk of territory where Viking laws. It was like a hostile Airbnb that never expired. At the center of this was Jorvik modern day. York, a thriving Viking city full of markets, metalwork. How his neighbors' goats kept breaking zoning codes. It became a major trading hub, filled with goods from across Europe. And some of the most creatively dangerous-looking cutlery you've ever seen. The locals, the Anglo-Saxons, were understandably annoyed. Imagine having your village taken over by people who pronounce everything differently and use the town square to dry their battle axes. Tensions rose, deals were made, broken and remade again. There were skirmishes, betrayals, and a lot of very stern letter writing from priests. But over time, things blended, cultures mixed, marriages happened. Some Anglo-Saxons became more Viking, and some Vikings became more slightly polite. Names changed, gods were swapped. The Norse brought new words into English like knife, egg, and Thursday, which was literally Thor's Day. So, yes, even your calendar is a little bit Viking. Not all Vikings stayed warriors. Many became farmers, craftsmen and traders. They built towns, planted crops, and occasionally remembered to stop raiding the neighbors. England wasn't conquered in one big dramatic moment. It was slowly absorbed, negotiated and rebuilt with equal parts sword and soup spoon. So next time you're in York, chewing on a sandwich and wondering why remember you're standing on Viking foundations built with axe swings. Eventually, someone in Viking land looked around at all the raiding, feasting, and thunder worship and thought, not because they had a sudden spiritual and a noticeable reduction in priests screaming and running. The conversion to Christianity didn't happen overnight. It took centuries, bribes, battles, and a few very awkward baptisms. Kings were usually the first to convert, not out of divine visions, but out of political brilliance. A Christian king could make alliances with powerful European rulers. Also, it was harder to get excommunicated from dinner invitations if you shared a god. Take King Harold Bluetooth, yes, that's where the phone thing comes from. He helped Christianize Denmark, probably after realizing that Odin never once sent a diplomatic envoy. Missionaries flooded Scandinavia with crosses, holy water, and nervous smiles. Sometimes they were welcomed. Sometimes they were told, politely, to leave before they became part of the soup. The old gods didn't vanish without a fight. In many places, Viking villagers hedged their bets praying to Jesus on Sundays and Thor on Mondays, just to cover all divine bases. Crosses and hammers were worn side by side. Churches were built right next to old pagan temples, like a religious standoff with better construction. Some dramatic moments came with the change. Idols were smashed. Sacred groves were chopped down. One enthusiastic chieftain tossed Thor's statue into... The statue didn't swim, case closed. But conversion also brought new ideas: literacy, architecture, shiny stained glass windows, and the concept of maybe don't solve all problems with arson. It reshaped Viking culture: new burial practices, new laws, and fewer goats being sacrificed in awkward ceremonies behind the barn. Still, even as crosses replaced runes, the Viking spirit didn't fade. They just found new ways to conquer with trade, marriage, and really passive-aggressive monastery donations. The gods may have changed, but the ambition stayed the same: leave a legacy, raid some bread, and never. Once upon a time, every Viking village had its own chieftain, usually a bearded man with opinions, several goats, and a deep love of shouting. But as time rolled on, those independent clans started to feel inefficient, especially when your neighbors were organizing into kingdoms and showing up with better armor and coordinated tax policies. And so the age of Viking kings began. No more endless village squabbles about sheep boundaries. Now it was time for crowns, thrones, and arguing in official buildings. In Norway, a man named Harald Fairhair decided he'd had enough of messy local politics. Legend says he vowed not to cut his hair until he united all of Norway, which means he spent a good few years looking like a mop with a sword. But he pulled it off. Battles were fought, oaths were sworn, and eventually Norway became more or less one kingdom, minus the occasional rebellion, sheep riot, or surprise cousin invasion. Denmark and Sweden followed a similar pattern. Powerful warlords became kings, often after a few conveniently timed deaths and peaceful transitions involving lots of arrows. With Christianity now in play, kings also got church backing. Priest holding a crown and nodding meaningfully. These kings brought order, or at least the Viking version of it. They created national laws, collected taxes, and tried very hard to stop their people from looting everything. Some kings went further, like Olaf Tryggvason, who forced Christianity on his subjects with the subtle tactic of convert. Centralization meant less local chaos, more castles, and fewer beheadings over stew recipes. Armies were more organized. Coins were minted with kingly faces instead of mysterious animal blobs. It was progress which naturally annoyed people who missed the good old days of raiding without paperwork. But this shift also changed the Viking identity. No longer wild sea wolves, they were becoming citizens of kingdoms. They still wore swords, sure, but now they had royal approval and budget meetings. The world was changing, the kings were rising, and the golden age of untamed Viking freedom, well, that was quietly heading toward its final saga. By 1066, Viking greatness was no longer booming, it was echoing. But that didn't stop Harald Hardrada, a king with an ego the size of Greenland, and a resume that included fighting in Byzantium, writing poetry, and generally behaving like a man who thought the world owed him a crown. When England had a little royal succession crisis, Harold saw an opening. And by opening, we mean full-on invasion. He sailed to England with a fleet, a dream, and what can only be described as overconfidence. He met little resistance at first, clashed with local forces, which is exactly what you don't want. To think before walking into a surprise ambush. Enter the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a moment historians agree is where things started falling apart faster than a flat-pack longhouse. King Harold Godwinson of England marched his troops over 180 miles in just a few days to launch a surprise counterattack. The Vikings, lounging near the river, probably mid-picnic, were caught completely off guard. One particularly dramatic tale says a lone Viking held the narrow bridge with an axe, slaying dozens until someone got clever and stabbed him from below the planks. It was the kind of bold last stand that looks great in a saga. The battle was brutal. Harold Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat, the kind of ending even the gods would wince at. The Viking army was crushed. Out of hundreds of ships that had arrived, the era of Viking invasions came to a screeching, soggy halt. It wasn't just a defeat, it was symbolic. The last great Viking king had made his move and lost. No more raids on England, no more fiery entrances. The old ways were collapsing under newer, more organized kingdoms with tighter borders, and fewer monasteries lying around unguarded. The world was changing, and the Vikings, for all their bravery, poetry, and excellent helmet collection, had just missed the last longship out. After Stamford Bridge, the Viking Age didn't end with a bang. It ended with a collective shrug, followed by someone mumbling, "Well, I guess we could start farming again." The great raids faded. The longships docked for good, and all across Scandinavia, axe-polishing businesses saw a sharp decline in customers. Europe had changed. Towns had walls now. Kings had armies on retainer. Monasteries had locks, guards, and a deep sense of paranoia. The element of surprise was gone. So was the easy loot. What used to be a daring raid was now just a really long walk to get arrested. The Vikings didn't vanish, they blended. Many had already settled in England, Ireland, Normandy, and beyond. They became farmers, traders, and citizens. Some even got real jobs like tax collector or mayor, which is basically just a Viking with paperwork and fewer dramatic entrances. Their gods faded too. Temples crumbled, replaced by churches and cathedrals. Odin got swapped for saints. Mead halls turned into courtrooms. The grand sagas gave way to contracts, censuses. Kids grew up hearing stories of past glory. When Grandpa raided Paris with a spoon, the world no longer needed warriors in fur. It needed farmers, blacksmiths, and people who didn't name every goat after a slain enemy. Even their ships, once feared silhouettes on the horizon, became museum pieces. Wooden skeletons of a wilder past, beautiful, powerful, and still smelling faintly of regret and smoked fish. By the 1100s, the Viking Age was officially done. Europe had moved on, and so had the Norse. The sword had been traded for the plough, the saga for the ledger. It wasn't defeat, it was evolution reluctant. Even the tamest former Viking probably still dreamed of the sea. Just once more to feel the wind, taste the salt, and raid something. Even if it was just the last slice of bread at dinner. For people who haven't shown up uninvited in 900 years, Vikings sure left a mark. Their ships are in museums, their gods are in movies, and their hairstyles are still turning. Heads at Renaissance fairs and questionable barbershops. But not everything you think you know about them is actually true. Let's start with the big one-horned helmets. They didn't wear them. Not in battle, not at brunch, not even for Halloween. The whole idea was invented in the 1800s by costume designers who thought history needed more flair. Real Viking helmets were practical, dome-shaped, and decidedly not trying to gore anyone during group hugs, but the myth stuck. So did a lot of others. Vikings were cast as brutish savages, but they were also farmers, engineers, poets, and traders. The same hand that swung a sword could carve runes, build boats, and assemble flat-pack furniture with alarming precision. Their language left traces in English words like anger, husband, egg, and even Thursday. Yes, every time you get to the fourth day of the week, you're honoring Thor, which is arguably more fun than honoring Greg from Human Resources. Their political legacy lingered too. Normans, descendants of Norse settlers in France, would go on to conquer England in 1066. So in a very roundabout way, the Vikings still kind of got the last laugh. With paperwork, modern fascination with Vikings blends fact with fantasy. They become symbols of strength, freedom, rebellion, and slightly concerning workout routines. TV shows, metal bands, and even sports teams have embraced the Viking vibe. Somewhere in Scandinavia, a very confused ghost named Bjorn is probably watching it all unfold and asking why nobody ever gets the beard length right. But the real legacy, it's in how the world remembers them, not just as raiders, but as survivors, explorers, innovators. A culture that carved its story into wood, stone, and eventually the collective imagination. They didn't just vanish, they evolved into legend. And like any good saga, the ending might be quiet, but the echo. The Viking Age didn't end because the world stopped needing warriors. It ended because even warriors grow old. The sails came down, the swords dulled, and the storm of history moved on. But the wake they left behind, it's still rippling through time loud. They were more than raiders. They were builders, dreamers, explorers, survivors. They carved homes into frozen ground, built ships that kissed every horizon and sang songs that outlasted empires. They believed in gods, ghosts, and gold. They lived loud, they died louder. The sagas live on in dusty books, tourist shops, and oddly intense video games. We name our kids after their kings, our ships after their storms, and our football teams after their vibes. And deep in the north, among the mountains and mist, you can still find stones marked by hands long turned to dust. Names scratched in runes that said, "We were here, and we were loud." The truth is, the Vikings never disappeared. They just became story-shaped. And maybe that's the best ending of all, not to fade, but to be retold. Around fires, in classrooms, through headphones as someone drifts off to sleep while history quietly shouts beneath the surface. So next time you feel the pull of the sea, or find yourself staring at a horizon with whispering across 1,000 years, not calling for war, just wondering what's out there just beyond the edge of the map. The long ships are gone, but the spirit, still sailing. Even when the long ships rotted and the axes rusted, the Viking spirit didn't call it quits, it just changed clothes. It left behind the beard oil and animal pelts, and instead slipped into the invisible threads of culture, a mindset more than a memory. Because the Vikings weren't just warriors with questionable hygiene and a flair for nautical property crime. Builders, people who stared at cold, endless water and said, it just moved in quietly, like a roommate who never really leaves. You see it in exploration. The drive to reach new places. The need to discover what's over the next hill, under the next rock, beyond the next algorithm. You see it in storytelling, bold, blunt, often exaggerated tales told with passion, humor, and too many details about goats. You even see it in how people handle challenges. The Viking approach was simple: keep going. If you fail, try again. If you fall, get up swinging. If someone steals your pig, take their village. But with style. Sure, most of us will row across oceans or name our child Blood Axe. But the essence remains: the hunger for challenge, the quiet defiance in the face of the impossible, the belief that if you just tighten your boots and keep rowing, this is the Viking afterlife, not in Valhalla, but in memory. In every bold risk, every leap into the unknown, every time someone says, well, that sounds crazy, but maybe we try it anyway. That's not just bravery. That's very old DNA whispering across time. So the next time you face something daunting, ridiculous, or wildly unwise, channel your inner Viking. Put your metaphorical helmet on no horns. Please, and remember, the real saga isn't what you conquer. And so the sails have lowered, the saga has sung its last verse, and the oars have stopped stirring the sea. The Viking Age has officially exited the building, preferably through the roof, dragging a goat and a barrel of mead for the road. The world they carved into fire and frost is now just echo and ash. A dusty footnote in someone else's textbook. But oh, what a noisy footnote it was. They gave us stories. And a completely fabricated idea about horned helmets. They offered drama, invention, and the kind of bold confidence that says, let's row west and see what gets mad. And we, centuries later, sit comfortably in our chairs, staring at screens, judging them. We mutter while microwaving cheese and ignoring history's full context. But deep down, we admire them, not for the chaos, but for the audacity. For sailing toward the edge of the known world with no compass, no backup plan, and a firm belief that they'd either find land or a good excuse. for building lives in ice, homes in stormlight, and stories that refuse to sit quietly on a shelf. Were they perfect? Not even close. They were wild, brilliant, dangerous, poetic, violent, curious, and almost certainly terrible at small talk. But that's what makes them unforgettable. Not because they conquered, but because they tried, repeatedly, dramatically, sometimes successfully, sometimes embarrassingly. And now, one question lingers. Not where did they go, we know that. But what did they almost become? If time had twisted a little differently, would we all be eating pickled herring on Viking Thursdays? The secret to Viking success wasn't just muscles, axes, and the world's most aggressive beard oil. It was boats. Not just any boats. Long, lean, mean machines built for speed, surprise, and occasionally smuggling goats. These weren't your average floating logs. Viking longships were the sports cars of the Dark Ages. If sports cars were powered by wind, rage, and 60 sweaty men rowing in sync. The longship was the Vikings' crown jewel, sleek, fast, shallow-bottomed, and designed with one purpose in mind, to get where it wasn't welcome as quickly as possible. Picture a knife slicing through water. That was a longship. Except this knife had a dragon's head, a sail big enough to double as a circus tent, and a crew that hadn't bathed in a month. These ships could glide through oceans, sneak up rivers, and if necessary, crash your backyard barbecue without using your front gate. And they weren't just fast, they were terrifyingly fast. A well-built longship could cover about 100 miles in a day. That's 100 miles of coastal villages nervously glancing at the horizon, wondering if the next cloud might have horns. They could show up out of nowhere like bad news with oars. Let's talk construction. These ships were made from oak, tough, flexible, and surprisingly floaty when you don't ruin it with Viking enthusiasm. Planks were overlapped and riveted in a method called clinker built, or that thing where every piece looks like it wants to argue. The hull flexed with the waves, giving the ship an odd bounce that made seasickness feel like a team-building exercise. And yes, they were light. So light, in fact, that when the Vikings hit land, they could just pick the whole thing up and carry it over to the next river. Imagine 40 grown men hoisting a wooden war canoe over hills, through trees, across fields, grumbling, slipping, probably yelling at Sven to stop dropping his end. But it worked. These ships were amphibious, not because they had wheels, but because the Vikings simply didn't believe in obstacles. Propulsion came in two flavors, wind and willpower. A single square sail made from wool, because cotton hadn't RSVP'd to Europe yet, caught the wind when it was blowing the right way. When it wasn't, the crew rowed, and they rowed hard, up to 60 rowers side by side, shoulder to shoulder, doing their best to move a floating wooden missile across open water while trying not to elbow each other in the ribs. Rowing wasn't optional, it was life or death. Or worse, falling behind your cousin's ship and being the last to loot the monastery. And since each man had his own shield, sword, and various unwashed smells, personal space was more of a dream than a policy. Now, navigation. How did they know where to go? Simple, they didn't. They felt where to go. Viking navigation was a mix of instinct, experience, and something called sunstones, mysterious crystals that may have helped find the sun through clouds. No compasses, no charts, just guesswork, backed by 1,000-yard stare and whatever birds happened to be flying by. Some historians believe they watched how seabirds flew to judge land direction. Others think they studied sea color and wave patterns. Personally, we think they just pointed and said, "That way looks pillageable. GPS, please?" This was more like GRIT, guessing, rowing, intuition, and tenacity. And when all else failed, they just kept going until they hit something interesting or angry. Let's not forget style. Viking ships weren't just fast and deadly, they were fashionable. The front, or prow, often had an elaborate carved dragon head. Not because they were showing off, okay, a little, but to ward off evil spirits, scare away sea monsters, and intimidate anything that didn't like carved wood, glowering at them from across the bay. The dragon head wasn't just decoration, it was a message. It said, "This ship means business. It has no brakes, and neither do we." They picked trees like they picked enemies, carefully and with a plan. A single long ship could take several months to build, and once done, it was tested in water, wind, and probably by being poked with a spear just for fun. These ships were strong enough to ride open seas, yet light enough to drag overland, turning geography into a suggestion. Life on board? Let's just say it wasn't a cruise. There were no cabins, no privacy, and definitely no buffets. The deck was low, the space cramped, and every inch packed with shields, gear, and sometimes livestock. Yes, actual animals. Chickens, goats, and the occasional cow tied down to keep morale and milk levels up. Picture this. You're rowing for 10 hours, soaked in sea spray, your arms screaming in pain. To your left is a man sharpening his axe with alarming enthusiasm. To your right, a goat with judgmental eyes. In the back, someone singing a sea shanty that hasn't rhymed in 3 verses. It's noisy, it smells, and it's exactly what the Vikings called a good day. But these ships weren't just for raiding. That's a common mistake. Vikings weren't just pirates with helmets, which, by the way, did not have horns. Sorry, cartoons. They were explorers, settlers, and traders. They used long ships to sail to far-off lands, barter for goods, relocate their entire families, or just leave behind in-laws who talked too much. From the icy coasts of Greenland to the rivers of Russia, from Ireland's shores to the gates of Constantinople, Viking ships made their presence known. These weren't small-time journeys. These were epic voyages across entire continents, with nothing but wood, wind, and good old-fashioned stubbornness. They discovered new lands, set up outposts, and occasionally forgot to go home. They reached North America hundreds of years before Columbus, landing in what's now Newfoundland. They didn't stay long, but hey, they made it. No postcards, but definitely history. So what did the longship really mean? It meant freedom. It meant speed. It meant danger and daring wrapped in oak planks and iron nails. It meant you could disappear from your fjord on Monday and show up on someone else's coast by Thursday looking for snacks and silver. The longship was more than just transport. It was a symbol, a weapon, a floating story that said, "We're not stuck on this cold rock anymore. We can go anywhere. We can be anywhere. And if we're showing up unannounced, you should probably hide the good stuff." So the next time you hear a knock at the door and see a long, narrow shadow stretching down your driveway, maybe check for oars. But let's not paint them as mere thugs with swords. Vikings were surprisingly organized, clever even. These weren't just mobs of wild-haired lunatics screaming about Odin and punching livestock. They were strategic, adaptable, and disturbingly efficient. They built entire fleets of longships faster than most kingdoms could finish arguing about them. These ships weren't just tools of war. They were wooden lightning bolts, slicing through waves with the speed of ambition and the muscle of a crew that hadn't slept in days and was fueled entirely by dried fish, mead, and adrenaline. And those ships were fast, sometimes too fast. Picture this. You're standing in your peaceful little village, admiring the sunrise, maybe baking some bread. And before you can ask, What's that horn sound? Your crops are on fire, your cheese is missing, and your Uncle Sven, different Sven, is now rowing for the other team. Eventually, the Vikings stopped leaving. That was the real twist. They stopped doing quick smash and grabs and started unpacking. What began as a camp became a fort. What became a fort turned into a trading post. What became a trading post became a full-blown town, then a kingdom, then several kingdoms. Nice coastline you've got here. Mind if we violently and permanently relocate? In fact, they established Dublin. Yes, the capital of Ireland began life as a Viking pet project. They called it Dyflin, which might sound like a dairy-free yogurt, but it became one of the most important Viking settlements outside Scandinavia. From there, they launched more raids, set up shop, and built a town complete with markets, forges, and probably at least one very confused Irish cow. And while we love the image of wild-eyed warriors foaming at the mouth, not all Vikings were berserkers or axe-throwing poets. Some were salesmen. Seriously. Vikings loved to trade. They traded furs, tools, jewelry, weapons, and yes, even people. Slavery was sadly a core part of their economic model, and if something could be chained and sold, they'd probably try. They had a serious thing for shiny stuff. If it sparkled, glittered, or looked like it belonged in a treasure chest, it was going on the boat. Silks from the east? Taken. Coins pocketed. Exotic spices they couldn't pronounce, tossed in the loot pile. They didn't always know what things were, but if it looked expensive, it was now theirs. Back home, Viking villages got rich, and not I bought a nicer tent rich. We're talking I built a longhouse with heated floors and my goat has a golden bell rich. Status came from loot, legend, and how many terrified monks whispered your name in prayer. If people in 3 countries were singing sad songs about your last visit, you were doing great. Viking culture thrived. These weren't just warriors, they were poets, craftsmen, and very enthusiastic party planners. Feasts were legendary. You hadn't truly lived until you'd seen a group of grown men arguing over who could drink more mead while balancing on a shield. They held storytelling competitions, sword duels, wrestling matches, and possibly invented the world's first who can yell the loudest contest. And as their reach grew, so did their identity. They weren't just the scary strangers from across the sea anymore. They were settlers, rulers, kings. They shaped the political map of Europe in ways that are still felt today. Normandy, for instance, the name literally means land of the Northmen, as in, these are the guys who showed up with axes, stayed for dinner, and never left. What's truly wild is that this era, often called the Viking Age, wasn't just a blip of chaos, it was an era of transformation, expansion, reinvention. It turned a scattered group of northern tribes into a force that changed the course of history. Europe learned, very slowly and usually while on fire, that the Norse weren't just barbaric raiders. They were a rising civilization with ships, systems, and serious ambition. They had no central king, no unified army, and no formal empire. But they didn't need one. Their power came from flexibility, from their ability to move fast, strike hard, and adapt to whatever the world threw at them. One moment they were burning down a monastery. The next, they were building a port city. The moment after that, they were hosting a wedding between a local princess and a Viking warlord named Eric, the mostly sober. You are still here, my friend? I can't believe it. This didn't help you fall asleep? Well, I will try harder in the next one to achieve that. You deserve a gold star. You are a trooper. type gold star in the comments below, and we'll know you made it to the end. I'm sure not many did. Good night, my friend, and thanks again for tuning in.